Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp. She's the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is March 6th, 2024. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. You can send us your questions and comments via email to questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them on the chat page in YouTube. Helga, it's clear that the rebellion of nations against the unipolar order and its so-called liberal democratic empire is deepening. And that was evident in the March 4th UN General Assembly meeting that took up the whole question of the use of the veto by the United States to stop the UN Security Council from demanding a ceasefire for Gaza. I'd like to begin by asking you for your analysis of this revolt as part of the global revolt of the Global South, and if you foresee the possibility that this could force a shift in the US-UK position of continuing its complicity with Netanyahu's murderous policy in Gaza.
Well, I mean, the reality on the ground is so overwhelmingly known to the whole world community that, it is absolutely astounding how the Western establishments are trying to pretend all of that is not taking place. But, it reminds me really of Schopenhauer, the world as will, as if a pure demonstration of willpower would make reality change, but that is not going to happen. I think the hesitation of the United States and European nations to finally come around and help, make sure that the killing stops, make sure that the weapon supply stops, make sure that the humanitarian aid can happen, and that a solution be found. Any day this is being blocked further, it does more damage to the reputation and image of the so-called value-based order. And I think we are reaching a point, and may have reached that point already, that this cannot be undone. And the consequences of this are of the utmost severity, because the whole world really depends on to find a solution based on diplomacy, based on negotiations. And the more the hardening of these positions occurs, the more difficult it becomes, because we are not only looking at the one crisis, we are looking at two regional crises which have the potential of leading to a world war. So I can only say that, I can only hope that the message which comes from almost every nation on the planet to the so-called global north or collective west, however you want to call it, that it does penetrate some minds and some ears, because unless the West is shifting and really moves into to settle these conflicts before they get out of control. But I find that the mental condition of the collective West establishment is really putting a big question mark. Are these people still in the real world, or are they not? And I can only say that the more that message is being gotten across, the better.
Now, there are several questions that have come in regarding both Gaza and Ukraine. Let me start with one from Ukraine, which is probably of particular interest to you, about the leak, the so-called leak of the discussion among German Air Force officials about the use of the Taurus missile against Russia, striking the Kerch Bridge, and so on. Now, Chancellor Schultz publicly again said he's opposed to providing Taurus missiles, but this leaked conversation raises the question of who is actually in charge of Germany's policy, and also who may have been responsible for the leak. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the interesting thing about this debate in the media is that they are all trying to cover up the reality of that conversation, that what these four officers of the German Air Force were discussing was scenarios of how to cover up German complicity in the delivery of these Taurus cruise missiles. Now, obviously, Scholz, as far as I know at this point, is holding out and says, no, and he probably listened to President Putin's recent speech. If we go ahead with that, that is definitely the red line, which makes Germany a war party and targets in Germany, basically being, the target of Russian counter-reaction and possibly leading to a general war. So I think Scholz is sort of holding out, but you have an absolutely unbelievable effort by the media to deflect the question of that this is actually, the involvement of parts of the German army, namely the Air Force, and trying to shift it to the discussion of how outrageous it was, who leaked it, was it the Russians? And, it is so unbelievable. I don't think this will hold because there are intelligent people, like, for example, even Focus, which is a mainstream media, had an article with the retired Oberst, I don't know the degree in English, Oberst AD Ralph Thiel, who basically says that, on the question of who leaked it, the most likely would be the British. And I think this is a breath of fresh air in terms of rational thinking. And he makes the point, not only are the British very experienced in hybrid warfare, but they have been visible for anybody who wants to see those forces who pushed the most for an escalation of the war. So I think that is definitely something to be considered. And they would have an interest to discredit Scholz, who they probably regard as an obstacle to the escalation with Ukraine. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is de facto what General Kuyat or General Ade Kuyat already said last August, namely that given the fact that the Ukrainians are clearly losing the war, and that was obviously, he saw this coming already half a year ago, the NATO would be in front of the question of either going for a diplomatic solution or going for an escalation. And, obviously we saw one escalation after the other. So, we are sitting right on the verge of this going completely all the way. And, I think Putin's message was also very clear. He delivered it very calm. But he said very clearly that, if the West is putting troops into Ukraine or any other escalation, that that Russia is prepared to use its doctrine, and the doctrine says if the territory of Russia is threatened, they will use nuclear weapons. The West is naturally trying, or the Western media are trying to change that Putin would be threatening the West with war. But if you look at the actual situation, there is nothing to support this whatsoever. I can only also advise people to listen to an extremely interesting interview, which was given by the Swiss intelligence expert Jacques Bole with the Overton magazine, in which he gives, in my view, a very sober assessment, including expressing the utmost frustration at the German government. And I don't even want to repeat what he said. You should listen to it yourself.
Well, we have also a comment sent in by Francis Boyle, the well-known attorney, human rights attorney, and he's writing about the trip of Benny Gantz, the Israeli war cabinet minister, who came to the United States earlier this week, met with Kamala Harris, met with Lloyd Austin, and you have sort of mixed messages. You had Harris calling for an immediate ceasefire, but then after the meeting with Gantz, clearly the green light was given to Israel to go ahead and invade Rafah. Francis writes that what Austin said is that there must be credible and implementable plan for protecting civilians and addressing the humanitarian situation prior to any ground operations in Rafah. But that seems highly unlikely. What do you make of this back and forth with the Gantz visit, what Harris had to say, and the fact that Biden is continuing to announce his full support for Israel?
Well, I think that the blame will come back to the Biden administration for everything which is happening right now, because not only does the Gantz visit reflect the fact that the political future of Netanyahu, everybody knows that the moment this war would stop, Netanyahu would not be in the office, and he would probably face criminal charges. And Netanyahu obviously wants to prolong the situation to avoid that which everybody is expecting to happen once the fighting stops. Now, I think that the blame or the guilt for the incredible tragedy which is happening in front of the world's eyes will entirely go back to the United States. And the more quickly people are in the United States, demanding that this horror show stops, and the better. But I'm very afraid that it does require a completely different approach, which is why we are pushing a completely different approach. We say that whatever, obviously you need an immediate stop of weapon sales, you need humanitarian aid, you need the ability for the UNRWA to function again, because they're the only organization on the ground which could quickly go back into their function, because they are used to it, and they have all the knowledge on the ground and so forth. So all of these things have to be done very quickly, but you need something even bigger than that, and that is why we propose the OASIS plan, which is the idea of having a comprehensive economic development, not only for Gaza and Israel and the immediate neighbor countries, but the entire region of Southwest Asia as part of a huge development and reconstruction program, which would include, everything from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and naturally Israel and Palestine, and a two-state solution. This all needs to be put as a package in a comprehensive Middle East conference, because if you don't give people hope, and our video, which I can only advise people, please watch it if you have not done it, and help us to distribute it, because it shows that if you put on the agenda for immediate implementation an economic development perspective, which starts with the production of lots of fresh water gained from desalination and other means, by building corridors and canals from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Black Sea, and that way have the fresh water available for agriculture, for reforestation, for the building of new cities, of infrastructure, of simply a development perspective for the entire large region of Southwest Asia. You have to have hope. You have to give young people some perspective of having a decent future where they can raise families, where they can, have a normal life of, studying, doing useful things with your life. Because if you don't put this on the agenda, what will happen is that even if you get some kind of a partial solution or ceasefire, but you don't have a perspective of hope, you will have new waves of conflict, of terrorism, of all kinds of, even war. So, are we the intelligent species or not? And that is the real question. So I'm quite hopeful, because since we circulate this video, we have gotten a lot of response. It has not yet broken out into the big public, except, I gave an interview to Global Times, which they published, and they did mention that the Schiller Institute is promoting this OASIS plan. So all the readers of Global Times now are aware of this, and hopefully the interest in this perspective will grow. And if you have any heart for what is happening to the people in Gaza right now, help us to put the OASIS plan perspective on the table, because I think that is the one factor which can, in my view, really shift the situation.
Now, there are a number of questions coming in about the developments recently in Europe. Debashis asks if the statements from Schultz and Borrell recently represent a difference between them and some of the more hawkish neocons. And then RJ sends in a question, is there anything to make of the widening rift between Macron and Schultz over the former's desire for an independent European army defense system and Schultz's seeming desire to stay reliant on US weapons?
Well, I can only say that from many discussions we had with military people in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, in other European, Italy for that matter, there is right now an absolutely behind the doors super fight. In France, people really are almost at a state of war with Germany because they regard Germany as a complete traitor. That doesn't mean that the French position is any better, because even this idea of Macron to send troops to Ukraine is correctly rejected by most sane forces in Germany. But in general, I mean, the problem is that rather than having a position of, like de Gaulle would say, to have Europe have a joint mission as for a positive role in the world, it does not really matter if you stay within geopolitics, meaning that it is legitimate to be in this campaign of racist hatred against Russia. And I think this is an argument which Jacques Bole, in this interview, which is really very interesting, he makes the argument that the present demonization against Russia is based on racism. That the Europeans have no clear aim, nor does the United States. They don't have a war aim, what they want to accomplish in this Ukrainian situation. When Austin is being asked, what is his idea, he says to weaken Russia. Baerbock says the same thing. I mean, they don't have an idea. The idea to just weaken an opponent and have soldiers fight for the sake of fighting, the latest reports are that there are already 500,000 people dead in Ukraine. That's according to Jacques Bole again and other sources, a 10-to-1 ratio of dead Ukrainians as compared to dead Russians. I mean, there should be no dead people at all, but nevertheless, I mean, there is what should be the perspective for young soldiers to enter a war, to be just in a meat grinder until you are dead. And I think this idea of just weakening Russia, I mean, I think the argument of Bole that it's based on a deep racist conception is absolutely truthful. And that has to be stopped. I mean, if we do not get off this geopolitical idea that there is any legitimate reason for this confrontation, we will end up in World War III in the shortest possible time. And I think the more people wake up to this effect, the better.
I think it's worth noting when you talk about what Jacques Bole said about this racism against Russia, that Keir Giles of Chatham House has written at least 3 books which are just filled with these slanders that you can't trust the Russians because they're almost genetically committed to lying and being dishonest. Now, Helga, we have a couple of other questions. And let me just say, you're listening to Helga Zepp of the Schiller Institute, and we can still take some questions at questions@schillerinstitute.org. There's a question that came in from a supporter in Washington State who is referring to the Super Tuesday results yesterday, in which Trump and Biden won Trump all but won, and Biden all of the primaries, basically wrapping up the nomination. So it looks as though it will be a Trump versus Biden election. So we have from Washington State, someone wrote, "I am not a Trump supporter, but appreciate his opposition to Biden's proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. But in an interview with Fox News yesterday, he said he supports Israel, saying, quote, 'You've got to finish the problem,' unquote, referring to Hamas. Doesn't this undermine his claim to be an opponent of the neocons and their wars?"
Yeah, I think it would tend to do that because, the problem is that if you do not stop the present geopolitical game, we will end up in World War III. I mean, just take the combination of, the Taurus cruise missile being able to reach Moscow, which, that's what these people are pushing, and the possibility of the Middle East crisis to get out of control. We are much, much closer to the danger of nuclear war than most people consider. And the problem with what Trump's position on the Middle East is basically that I have not seen any sign that he is really thinking about a new paradigm. And I can only say that depends to a large extent on other candidates, like the independent candidates, and hopefully reasonable people within the Trump campaign who respond to, the message Biden got, for example, not only in Michigan, but I think now also, I think it was Minnesota. You correct me if I'm mistaken, but a lot of abstentions expressing, total disagreement with Biden's policy on the Middle East. So I can only hope that the analytical forces of Trump and that people advise him, he gets the idea on his own, that an absolute change is necessary, and that the only way for the world to survive is, to stop this geopolitical thinking. The world is not a zero-sum game. It is not a game where one wins and the others lose. The entire global south is moving in the direction of cooperation, of a win-win strategy, of the idea of building a completely new system where everybody can prosper and get richer. And if the North, the collective North, is not waking up to the idea that they have to join this new way of thinking, then I think the best would be that the West collapses, which they will, because we are very fast on that train already. And, in the worst case, we end up in annihilation of the entire civilization.
And you're right, it was Minnesota, and it was a larger uncommitted vote in the Democratic primary against Biden and reflecting opposition to his war policy than even the week before in Michigan. We'll see whether he's getting the message or not. Now, I have a question that came in about the UN session yesterday, where Philippe Lazzarini, who's the chairman of the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is doing most of the humanitarian aid in Gaza, he said that the withholding of funds has brought it to the brink of an imminent collapse, meaning the one agency that's providing aid is collapsing and is being deliberately collapsed by Netanyahu's policy and then Biden and a number of other countries withholding funds. But the person who wrote the question said, as a self-described UN skeptic, can the UN Relief and Works Agency be trusted, given the charges that there are many of its members who were involved in the attack from Gaza on Israel on October 7th?
Well, I think what we see right now is that there are about 1.5 million people around Rafah and a few people left in the north of Gaza, and they're all acutely about to die of hunger. If the world is watching that and not doing everything possible to provide these people with the means of survival, I don't think that this stain in the human conscience ever will go away, no matter what. So the only human thing would be to immediately reinstall the UNRWA capability. And, I don't know, that the world is not reacting. It's already a big discussion. Why are the neighbors of Gaza not acting? Why are the other Arab countries are not acting? And that is definitely a criticism which will become louder as this thing drags out. But I think the key question is really, it comes back to the United States, and it comes back to Great Britain, and unfortunately to Germany, who has a position which is unbelievably, inhuman, to say the least. In Germany, you are not allowed to even mention what the International Court of Justice in Den Haag is saying. If you repeat just what the court is saying, you can be punished. It's unbelievable what's going on in Germany. So I think that, if you have 1.5 million people who are starving, and the German media, for example, they're not reporting that. They're saying, oh, there is the threat of a hunger starvation crisis, we are on the verge of it. We are in the middle of it. People are dying already. And if there's any sense of proportionality, I think we have to get a real escalation of the mobilization. And as I said already, you have to do everything possible to save the people who are now in acute danger of dying. And as we are talking here, they die like flies as the minutes run out. So the immediate help has to occur, but then we need a shift in the direction of really putting yourself ahead on a higher level and say, are we human beings or are we not?
Now, there was an interesting development yesterday. Antony Blinken sent out a message saying that Victoria Nuland is resigning or retiring. Obviously, this is too late, given the damage she's done, but there was a question sent in. Do you think she left to avoid the blame when it comes to the question of who lost Ukraine?
Well, there are people who actually have done some more research, and they claim that the money which she raised and her apparatus raised was not 5 billion for NGOs for color revolution in Ukraine, but more like 12 billion. And, obviously, the Ukraine situation is an utter failure. And there will come the question of who lost Ukraine, because, when the United States and Nato left Afghanistan in a complete haste, and we all remember the rather shameful departure from the Kabul airport, which was completely uncoordinated and almost like a flight, there was a discussion already then, where people said, well, what is the United States and what is NATO doing for the people who were working with them, the so-called, I don't know this word in English, the Ortskräfte, the people who from Afghanistan who collaborated with NATO in the 20 years. They were left practically, behind. And the Ukraine situation, now you have already a big debate in the United States, no more money to Ukraine. And the big danger obviously is, and as this escalation is threatening with the Taurus missile as an immediate step, if the Ukraine is lost, it will for sure continuously damage the reputation of the West, of the United States, as the myth of the invincibility of the unipolar world or the rules-based order. It will go down the drain. Now, that is better than if you have an escalation leading to World War III. So the only elegant way out of this situation is to really say, okay, this was a mistake. We go back to where at least we were in March 22, where it now becomes more clear that Zelensky was completely ready for a compromise in Istanbul, that even the German and French government agreed to the denazification, which even Zelensky would have agreed with. So that was an immediate option to stop the war. And, the role of Boris Johnson, who went in from London into Kiev and said, no, you have to keep fighting. I mean, that should be also investigated, because it's not only against the UN Charter and against most constitutions to prepare a war of aggression. One should also consider, if not the effort to stop the possibility of ending a war does not fall under the same kind of, scrutiny. So I think that the only elegant way would be to really immediately stop and say, let's have a negotiation. The Chinese Ukraine envoy is apparently traveling in several countries in Europe right now, including Ukraine and Moscow. And the 12-point program by the Chinese still is, a very reasonable approach to start a diplomatic solution. And that should be put on the agenda with the utmost urgency.
We have one final question, which I think you've actually answered this so far several times today, but the fact that it keeps coming up and with a certain amount of urgency. This is from Angela in Italy. And she says, I appreciate your efforts to avoid a new world war, but one question comes to my mind again and again. How is it possible that the world can tolerate what's going on in Gaza? Why is it not possible to stop Netanyahu? And she says, I'm asking because despite the fact that I've tried to do my best to stop these horrendous crimes from being committed, after all these months, nothing has changed. I feel hopeless and helpless. Can you think of a collective action that could be done internationally?
Well, I have to say the same thing I said already. I think if there would be, let's say, a group of countries who would put the Oasis plan in earnest on the agenda, making speeches about it, making TV programs about it, or have a group of, let's say, Nobel Prize winners who would say, there is actually a plan of how the interest of every country in the region can be addressed, or any kind of prominent people, let's say former presidents, former heads of state, or all religious leaders, the Pope, the various religious leaders of Judaism, of Islam, if they would get together and say, let's put the Oasis plan of development on the agenda, that could change it. You need something drastic. And if you don't give up, don't become despaired. I mean, I know that is very difficult. Sometimes you tend to say it's also absolutely horrible, that I better go back to my private life and don't listen to the news anymore. I mean, there are many people who say this or express that, but that doesn't help. It just helps the people who are the warmongers to get ahead. But I think if we all mobilize in the Schiller Institute and the International Peace Coalition, that's what we are really trying to accomplish. If we would get some countries, some heads of state, some former heads of state, some Nobel Prize winners, or any combination of religious leaders, really top leaders, to come out and say the only way is peace through development. The new name of peace is development, and here is the Oasis plan which can do it. It would inspire everybody. It would inspire the people in the region. It would inspire the neighbor countries. It would really, and I have thought about it a lot, and the proposal made by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, already in 1975, it's still the only way how to get peace in the Middle East. So join our efforts, come to our weekly IPC, International Peace Coalition discussion this coming Friday, and mobilize all your friends to join the effort.
And I think people can go to theschillerinstitute.com and look at the video, the 14-minute video on the Oasis plan. And one suggestion, look, we're now in the beginnings of the hot phase of the 2024 election. Candidates are going to be campaigning all over the country, and take the lead from Diane Sayre, Jose Vega, and other LaRouche organization members who are going to these town meetings and presenting the Oasis plan and putting the candidates on the spot on this. So that's something that people can do as a way of bringing this into the public attention. So Helga, thanks for joining us today. Any final words?
Well, get active. This is not a period to be a couch potato or be a by watcher on the fence, because it is you which makes the difference. Because if good people unite for a plan, they can bend the arm even of the worst tyrant. These are the words of Friedrich Schiller, but I think he was on the mark.
Okay, thank you, and see you next week.
Till next week.